Hello, my name is Erica, and today we'll be walking through the steps of how to draft elevations, sections, and isometric drawings. So first, let's begin with orthographic drawings, and we'll be learning how to set up a grid, draft elevations, and draft sections as well. Before we begin drafting, we need to set up our space, and here I have set up my drafting surface similarly to how it was done in Chow's video, but I've added a second ruler that I've taped perpendicular to the first, and this will give us two directions to slide. Also, I've taped down the page so it doesn't slide around while we work. Our first step is to set up the grid, and because our unit is comprised of chunks in 1-inch increments, we can make a 1-inch by 1-inch grid. Starting off, I place my triangle up against the bottom ruler and use the vertical edge to draw thin, light lines every 1 inch. I'm using the markings on the ruler, but you can either mark the inches out on tape like Chow showed, or measure out the intervals before beginning. And I recommend you draw with light pressure using a sharp, hard pencil so the grid lines don't interfere with your drawing later when you add more details. And I'm realizing that the lines are not very visible, so I'll insert a scan of the final grid here. Now that we're done with the vertical, we can move on to the horizontal lines, essentially just repeating the same process, sliding the triangle down the ruler. This could also be a good application for the parallel glider or rolling ruler, especially when you hold it up against a straight edge to ensure its squareness. So now that our grid is set up, we can begin by drawing in construction lines and using them to plan out the placement of the drawings on the page, as well as create bounding boxes for each of our drawings. Since the models are essentially 3-inch by 3-inch by 3-inch cubes, we can set up 3 by 3-inch bounding boxes for both of the elevations and the section. Today I'll be drafting elevations A and B, which have a common edge here for the placement of the elevations. I'm going to locate the drawings in a row so that we can show the continuations of the geometries from elevation to elevation. And again, we'll want to draw light lines as to not interfere with any future aspects of the drawing. And we can begin drawing the external construction lines by moving our triangle 1 inch in and drawing a vertical line. Then we move the triangle 3 inches over and repeat that again with a 1-inch space in between. And for the horizontal construction lines, we'll want to place the top of the elevations around 2 inches from the top of the page and leave another 1-inch gap between the rows, which gives us space for the title and drawing labels in. Now that our bounding boxes have been set up, we'll want to label the locations of each of our drawings, keeping in mind the connection between the elevations. So I went in and labeled the top 2 rows with both elevations, placing section 01 beneath elevation A. So the first step to creating the elevations is to draw the internal construction lines. And to do this, we begin by identifying the locations of the spatial edges, also known as the edges of the faces that we can see. On this face, these would be the spatial edges. And you can either measure the distances on the model to create the construction lines, which is especially helpful when things are not as even as our cubes are, But since the cubes are essentially comprised of increments of 1 inch, we can just refer to the grid drawn on our page. So our first vertical construction line on elevation A is located 1 inch in from the left edge of the bounding box, and so we will add a construction line in there. And then our next one occurs 2 inches in from the left side. And then in the horizontal direction, the first construction line occurs 1 inch from the base, and our second construction line occurs 2 inches up from the base. And this construction line helps to show that there's a geometric continuation between elevations A and B, so we will draw it all the way across both bounding boxes, helping to show the relationship between the elevations. Now that we have all of the interior construction lines set up for elevation A, we can use those construction lines to identify the segments that represent the edges of the faces that we see in elevation, or the spatial edges. And to begin, we will draw the outline of the entire elevation that we see. Here I'm going to begin with this L situation on the left, which is there on the drawing. And now we can go in with the rest of the outline of the elevation. In general, I like to keep the initial lines of my drawings thin. That applies to the lines that I'm adding in right now, as well as the construction lines and grid lines, because we'll be adding in line weights later, and so it's best to have thin line weights to begin with so we can add a larger variety. And now, with the outline of elevation A complete, we'll want to go in and add the remaining interior spatial edges, the L on the right. So now that elevation A is finished, we can begin on elevation B, repeating the same process as with elevation A. So we'll be starting with the interior construction lines, and we can see that the only horizontal construction line needed on elevation B has been covered by the line that we extended from elevation A previously. And so going into the vertical construction line, there is a spatial edge located 1 inch in from the right side of the cube, and so we can add a line there on our drawing. Now, with the construction lines for elevation B complete, we can follow the same process for drafting the elevation, beginning with the outline of the elevation, or the exterior spatial edges, which, in this case, is essentially just the bounding box square. So now that we have the exterior spatial edge drawn in, we can go in and add the interior spatial edge condition, which is essentially drawing in this L shape on the face of the model. So with both of our elevations complete, we can move on to the section. And the first step to creating a section is to identify the section cut marker on the elevation it cuts through, which in our case is elevation B, and the section cut can be seen on the model as the white line that wraps all the way around the model, cutting it in half. And for section 1, we want to look to the right side of the elevation B, so we can imagine removing this. So to draw the section cut marker, we draw two flags emerging from the edges of the elevation that denote that the section cut runs right down the middle of the elevation. And after drawing the vertical lines, we can go in and start drawing the flags that denote the direction that we are looking at in this section. In this case, we're looking to the right, so we should draw two flags, one on the upper and one on the lower marker, both pointing to the right. Now that the section cut flags are drawn in, we can add labels to the section cut markers that refer back to the section. So I'm going to go in and add an O1, and then another O1. So moving on from the section cut marker, we can go in and add the construction lines for the section cut. Looking at our model, we see that the section cuts through this zigzag portion, which essentially looks like this part of elevation A. And we can follow the same process for locating the construction lines, this time mainly looking at what is cut through rather than finding the spatial edges. And so the vertical construction lines happen 1 inch in and 2 inches in from the left, and the horizontal lines happen 1 inch from the top and 2 inches from the top. And once our construction lines are complete, we can begin to draw the part that is cut through. Just as before, we will be using the construction lines to locate the edges of the section. So now I'm just going in and drawing the zigzag shape that is cut through. Great, so now that we're done with our part that is cut through, we should look for things that we can see in the elevation. In this case, we see this smaller plane of side A because we are looking to the right, so let's add that in. Now that the section cut is drawn and the elevation/background information is added, we want to go in and poche the section cut so that we can differentiate it between what is cut through and what is not cut through. And I'll be using my 45-45-90 triangle, and I've also removed the vertical ruler so that the triangle has more space to slide around. I'll be creating a diagonal hatch poche, but there are many different kinds of poche, and here are a few other options. And there are many different ways to approach poche, so I suggest having some fun with it. I like to start my hatches at the end and pull the triangle backwards along the ruler away from the previously drawn line to avoid any smudging of the pen or pencil. And I'm drawing a pretty dense hatch with about a 1/16 inch spacing, but you can experiment with different spacings for the hatch lines. As you can see, all these diagonal lines are pretty much blending together into a light gray poche. And hatch poche is a great application for the parallel glider as it's made for drawing many parallel lines. So I will insert a clip of me using it here. And as with the triangle, I like to drag the parallel glider away from the previously drawn lines just so I don't risk smearing any graphite or wet ink. And I'll be showing a horizontal hatch with about 1/16 of an inch spacing. And one of the nifty features of a rolling ruler or parallel glide are the measurements on the side of the ruler. And today I'm going to use those in conjunction with the markings on the ruler to the right to ensure consistent spacing for it. And sometimes I like to measure out each line of the hatch perfectly, but it's definitely not a requirement, and people make great poche without measuring every time, and it just takes some practice. I also prefer to use a parallel glide against the side of a ruler to keep the lines extra straight and parallel wherever possible. When you're hatching or drafting, make sure your lines are drawn smoothly and consistently, because we don't want it to skip like the example that you can see directly to the left. As the ruler moves down farther, you can see some larger gaps that were made there. And we're almost done. So there you have it, a horizontal hatch using the parallel glider. This technique can be applied to any parallel lines you're drawing, and I'll link other videos in the description that I found that have some more tips and tricks for using the parallel glide and rolling ruler. So once we've completed the poche of the section cut, it's time to add line weights to our orthographics. And I've put the vertical ruler back in place, and we will be returning to our 30, 60, 90 triangle. Adding line weights helps to clarify the drawings further by adding depth to the elevations and sections. So beginning with the elevations, we can follow the logic of the closer the face, the thicker the line. The closest geometry on elevation A is this zigzag shape here, and we can begin by using our thick line weight and outlining that form. Following that, we will add in the line weight for the next closest face with a medium weight writing utensil, ensuring that the line weight gets thinner as it gets farther from the viewer. And so I'll go in and trace the outline of the smaller back face with a thinner pen. And now that we're done with that, moving on to elevation B, we again will look for the closest geometry to the viewer. And for elevation B, that's this L shape in the upper right-hand corner. So going into the drawing, we'll trace this shape with a thick weight writing utensil. Then, following the same process as elevation A, we can go in and add the thinner line weight for the next face. Now, moving on to the section cut, we'll be following the logic of whatever is cut through gets the thickest line weight. And so we'll go in and trace the zigzag with our thickest pen or pencil. And once we're done line weighting the section cut, we can go in and add light line weight for anything seen behind the section cut, or just whatever is in elevation. Ta-da! So here is our finished orthographic drawing. Now we can move on to axonometric drawings. More specifically, we'll be covering setting up a diagrid and drafting our model from an isometric viewpoint. Again, we'll want to set up our paper and workspace as the first step. Here I removed the horizontal ruler so that our triangle has some more freedom to slide up and down the other ruler. And our diagrid begins by us drawing 30-degree lines in both directions and moving in 1-inch intervals. And so I'll begin here, drawing diagonal lines every 1 inch. And I'm drawing the grid lines pretty heavily, but again, I do not recommend you draw them as heavily as I am. It is mostly for show. These lines should be as exact and even as possible because we'll be trying to connect the intersection points with a vertical line down the center of them, and in the few times that I've tried this, I've messed it up all of the times because my inches are not as exact as a computer would make them. And so now that we've completed one direction, we'll do the same steps in the opposite direction, just flipping the triangle and moving down the ruler instead of up. Now that we've completed all of the diagonals, we'll want to go in and add vertical lines that connect the points of intersection. And so I've added the bottom ruler back on so that the triangle has something to slide against. And I just draw lines of the same darkness up through the points of intersection of the diagonals. Great. After setting up the diagrid, we can follow a similar process as with the elevations. So we'll begin with the exterior bounding box / construction lines, and I've labeled the sides on my model for clarity. As we noted before, our models are essentially a 3-inch by 3-inch by 3-inch cube with chunks taken out in 1-inch intervals. So our first step will be to draw that 3-inch cube as the bounding box. That line got pretty long, but we'll just ignore it and move on. Usually construction lines aren't this bold, so it won't matter as much if you do the same. Now, with the exterior bounding box complete, I've added in corresponding labels for each face that we're going to be drawing today, and we can match each of the drawn faces to the ones on the model. Now we will add in construction lines based on the spatial edges of each of the faces, following the same logic as we have while creating the elevations earlier. Essentially, we'll be looking at where the model touches the bounding box, and we will be approaching each face individually and then coming back in afterwards to connect them. So on elevation A, there is a vertical edge 1 inch in, and another 2 inches in. Then there are horizontal edges at 1 inch in and 2 inches in from the bottom of the model. Now that the elevation A construction lines are complete, we can move on to side C. And this face here touches the bounding box, and it looks like that ledge occurs 1 inch in from the back of the model. And so we'll go in and add a construction line at that point. Now, moving on to face B, we can add in the same construction lines as we did for elevation B, wherever the model touches the bounding box. Basically, we're following that L shape again. And now that we've completed all of our interior construction lines, we can use them to identify the spatial edges / edges of the face / faces that touch the bounding box. So I'm just going in and drawing lines where the model touches the bounding box. And then this is me deciding that I need a thicker pen. And now that we have the correct writing utensil, we shall go around all 3 faces and draw in the appropriate lines. So now that the elevations are drawn on the exteriors of the face, we will go back in and connect them with interior lines. So from left to right, the first interior line that we'll be adding is this little ledge back here. And there I am identifying it on the drawing. Now that that's drawn in, we see this and there it is on the drawing, but we can also think about it as the first part starts at the edge of face A and goes 2 inches in from there, and draw that in. And then the next interior line to add is this one that occurs 1 inch in from the right side of B, which connects back to that line that we just drew. Next, we should add in that interior corner that extends up from the meeting point of these 2 lines. Great, and now we have a beautiful yet unline-weighted isometric drawing. Again, adding line weight to a drawing adds depth and clarity, even more so for an isometric or generally a 3-dimensional drawing. The first line weight that we're going to add is the profile line, and this will be the thickest line weight on the drawing, outlining the entirety of the form. Essentially, it defines where the model ends and the background begins. So next we'll add in the spatial edges, and this is a medium line weight, defining where there is an overhang or corner with air behind it. The first one that we'll be looking at is the first one off the left, which is this transition from the vertical face of side A and the horizontal face of side C. So we can see that there's air located behind the face, and it doesn't connect directly to the face adjacent to it in the drawing. And so there's also this overhang at the front of the model, and again, it doesn't directly connect to the faces adjacent to it in the drawing, so we should show both of them as having air behind them. And lastly, we will add in the planar edges, essentially wherever there is a plane change or a surface transitions from one direction to another, and anywhere we have not added line weight yet. And I made all of my lines on this drawing very, very dark, and so it makes it difficult for the line weight to pop, which is a prime example of why I recommend making the grid lines and construction lines very light and keeping the initial drawing lines rather thin. So I've included a scan of a previous iteration of this drawing where the line weights are more correct and they look delicate and also describe the geometries and depth much better than the muddled line weights of the most recent edition. Thanks for watching this tutorial, and here are a few tips and tricks that I've compiled here at the end. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.